Good morning. This is Dr. Matthew Dunn, host of The Future of Email with an awfully stupid case of laryngitis. And my guest today, Rob Ashton from the UK, correct?
Absolutely. Hi, Matthew. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Hey, Rob. Rob and I can't remember how we connected, but Rob is going to be one of the most interesting guests we've ever had in the world of email because we're going to talk about writing and the importance of writing and communication. And then I'll stick visual communication stuff in there and we'll compare notes. Give people a bit, excuse me, give people a bit of background on yourself and emphasis, the company you founded and what you're doing now.
Well, I've been involved in the world of improving written communication for over 30 years, first as an editor,
Yeah.
and then as founder of the company you mentioned, Emphasis, which is a training consultancy specializing in written communication. Founded that 24 years ago. Since when it's worked with 80,000 people around the globe, all over the globe, and which is amazing. I still can hardly believe it myself, and that's all been in small groups. It's but it's been a privilege to work with a huge range of organizations, from the tech giants of Silicon Valley to even the royal household at Buckingham Palace. So that was the company I founded. But I started off as a scientist. So there's always been something in me that was curious about the science of written communication and how the words we read and the words we write affect what we think and do. And so 6 years ago, I set off on a journey to really delve into that. And now I'm doing that full time. I write about it, and I've recently stepped down from running that company, which is still very much alive and kicking, to focus on raising awareness of the real science behind this. Which there's a surprisingly small amount of good quality information, certainly in the business sphere on the web, on this topic. There's a lot of pseudoscience, a lot of hearsay and wishful thinking. But the science that researchers have been working on doesn't really get much of an airing. So I'm kind of waging a one-man battle to redress that.
Well, excuse me, that is wonderful material to delve into. Just for context, because I think we'll use it in the course of the conversation. Back up to Emphasis for a second.
Yeah.
And tell me a bit about why a Silicon Valley giant or Buckingham Palace or someone would say, oh yeah, we really should invest in our people being better in their written communication.
Well, that's a really great question. It's because I think writing is something that's, as a topic, is misunderstood. And I'm not talking about the research, I'm talking about our perception of it. When you mention writing to most people, they think, what, creative writing or writing a novel? What do you mean? But writing is something we do all day now.
Yeah.
When I back in 1998, when I set up Emphasis, people were talking then about writing being on the way out, and it's something that we're going to do less and less of. And how crazy is that? Looking back, you just think we had no idea, because in fact, we're more likely to write now almost than we are to speak. If you try to get in touch with a help desk or customer services of a company, it's going to be live chat, which is a complete misnomer, because it's not chat at all, is it? It's writing.
Yeah.
We've been emailing for a very long time. And now I think the latest stats I have was 319 billion emails sent and received every day.
Every day, yeah. That's
last year. And that's going up by 15 to 20 billion emails per day, per year, every year.
Yep.
So if my phone rings, I assume something's wrong. But then with those organizations, that they recognize that it's something their people are doing all day, but also it becomes the primary tool of influence. So if you are trying to execute on a strategy, you've got the strategy, you've got the execution, you've got the results, you've got the feedback. In between all of those things, you've got communication, and it's usually written communication, because that's how you disseminate information throughout an organization. So in the case of the public sector, of governments. Um, you mentioned the royal household. People need briefing. If people are going to make big decisions, they need the information, and they'll usually do that by requesting a report on it and then an update on the report. And that's, of course, equally true in the private sector and with those very successful organizations that Emphasis has worked with. But then in between all of that, we are communicating more and more just peer to peer. So you've got corporate chat services like Slack, where again, it's all writing. So go back to 2020 when the world started working from home. Zoom hit the headlines, and Zoom sort of moved from being this thing that was kind of a niche product that maybe self-employed consultants and coaches used to something that most people had heard of. And so it seemed like we were on Zoom all the time, and we were meeting, spending hours in meetings. In fact, what the data shows is we spent less time in meetings than we did before. We were having more meetings, but shorter ones. But what were we doing in between? We probably weren't on the phone. We were probably messaging and emailing each other. So we've become a species that communicates largely using the written word.
Right. And companies that are, to just back up to my earlier question, so companies that recognize the centrality of that will say, helping people get better at this will only help us as a company. Fair?
Exactly. And the other reason it's an interesting question is that when you look at those organizations, even the ones who get it will usually be just a subset of that company.
Yeah. Yeah.
So people, you have the grammar and punctuation Nazis, kind of thing, kind of really, who think that language is a certain way and should be frozen in aspect, and that's it. Nothing changes, and I'm not saying grammar and punctuation aren't important, but that you can have something that is perfectly punctuated, that follows whatever prescriptive grammar you are following, and that piece of writing can completely fail and get no results. So it's not the most important thing. I say to people, understanding grammar is to communicating what understanding a workshop manual is to driving a car. It's of course it's important what's happening under the hood, and somebody needs to understand it. But it's still not going to get you from A to B. So there's that, and really, I think that the reason that I am spending all this time now writing about this and researching this is partly because I don't think even in those organizations, most people don't realize how much writing they do, and therefore what opportunity there is to optimize what they're doing, and therefore optimize how the company runs, even increase profits. It's one of those things that's just hidden in plain sight. We just don't see what we're doing all day. But fortunately, there are people who do recognize that, and that they get an edge. But it's also one of those things you only really get once you see it, once you see the change. Once you see a piece of writing that you thought was okay,
Yeah.
and then you learn how to work on it, and then you kind of go. And people have said this. Oh, okay, I get it now. I can't believe that I ever let that go out as it was before, because wow, that was going to be really tiring to read or very easy to ignore.
Yeah.
And it really, I can see that by fine tuning it like that, it transforms the effectiveness. And because we're doing it all day, it's the rising tide that lifts all boats. If you work on written communication.
I'll give you a straw man. You may be familiar with this, but I'll give you a straw man so we can sort of finish whacking on why businesses should do this, because I totally agree. Amazon, headquartered just south of me here, has a fairly well-known practice for big projects of the way a project gets kicked off is the person who's spearheading it comes in with a written memo. I believe it's 6 pages max. And everybody in the meeting sits and reads it and then discusses it. And I know from having read about Amazon, they were a client for a previous company of mine. Um, there's a lot of work into the writing of that 6-pager because the entire thing could be a bazillion-dollar project. We'll pivot on whether or not that communicates well. That seems like an example of, yeah, this is worth doing. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely, and I've seen that. I've heard of that too. I've heard it was instigated by Jeff Bezos himself. I don't know if I don't know if that's true or not. But yeah, absolutely. And I think if you can get that down to that 6 pages,
Yeah.
and really you want to be able to sell it on the first page. You know, you don't want to be relying on somebody. If you haven't got them by the end of the first page, then you're probably on the back foot, and you may never catch up. But what people do is, and what this overcomes is they tend to just assume that writing is a question of transferring data from one brain to another. And
Yeah.
therefore, if you just put the information down, then it will somehow magically work. And when you're forced to whittle it down, then that can be very powerful. I would say though, I would caution that it's not just about brevity, and sometimes longer is better. And this is one of the things that is a bit of a misconception about effective writing, that short is always better. And particularly, if you think about things that are really stripped down to their bare bones, devoid of context, devoid of narrative, that they are quite likely to fall flat. And I'm thinking there, for instance, of bullets. People often use bullets, just a series of bullets, because they think this will make it short, so I'll just write in bullets. And in fact, there was there was a piece of writing. It was a blog post on the HBR blog a few years ago, which was about writing like the military. And it went viral. It really got shared far and wide. People were saying, yeah, I really like that. And they were saying things like, bottom line up front, which is very much a military thing, certainly in the US and British military. Give me the bottom line first and then justify it, which is not actually how you persuade anybody. If I say to you, I'm going to sell this widget and it costs $300. Do you want it? Okay, now let me tell you why. Immediately you're kind of going, well, no, I don't want it. And all your defenses are up, so bottom line up front doesn't always work.
Right.
Just using bullets is rarely works, because it's a bit like trying to learn from somebody else's revision notes. It's kind of, if you've been in a lecture and you've made some notes, they'll mean something to you. You hand them to someone else, probably won't mean anything to that person.
Right.
And it's the same with bullets. They are summaries of your thoughts, not summaries of anybody else's. So they don't connect for that reason. And I mentioned narrative. As well as I do, the importance of story in how we make decisions. We tell ourselves stories all the time. And I mean all the time. You're walking down the street, you're telling yourself a story. With you is that you are the hero of your own story, and if you read something that has no story, because you need story to make sense of it, you're going to create your own. And it could be, I don't know why this person is sending me this. I don't understand these notes. This person doesn't, does this person know what it's talking about? Or I don't know. Is this important? And you've got that inner narrative, which has got nothing to do with what's been written. And your reader is making it up themselves, and you completely lost control. And that's one of the big mistakes that people make when they're trying to be brief. So to say, brevity is laudable, and certainly most documents are way too long. So yeah, shoot for that. But it's not the end of pardon the pun, it's not the end of the story.
Right. It's not the end of the story. This is a funny thing to drag in because it's more than just writing, but that previous company I mentioned where Amazon, among others, were a client. I co-founded one of the first companies to do what everybody now calls explainer videos. 2009, say it visually. And so for 4 or 5 years, great run, we had companies, mostly Fortune 100, coming out of the woodwork as video was just starting to take off, and we'll get outside of words into other parts of media eventually, maybe. But what they were hiring us to do was to communicate their thing clearly, compellingly in 2 or 3 minutes. And it was a fun ride to learn how to do that with them. And among the things I discovered, one, frequently they couldn't get out of their own way. The people who knew the subject best were the biggest pain on the project because they couldn't put a boundary around it. They wanted to shove the encyclopedia into a matchbook. It won't work, guys. Sorry, it won't work. They had no priority. We want this and this and this and this and this. I'm like, fine, you get 3. Which are the 3 important ones? Well, we want more than 3. Sorry, you don't get more than 3. You're like, what's the important thing? And then putting a narrative structure to it, which like, and sometimes they feel like, oh, well, we can't possibly do that. I said, if we don't do that, no one's going to pay any attention. Like if we can't find or create the storyline that carries this thing, it's not going to work, right? It'll be just facts with decorative characters, and no one's going to care, or they're not going to remember it. And sometimes I felt like our job was to not know their subject and bring some rigor and structure and method, and frankly, to charge them enough where we had the right to say, nope, too bad. This is how it works. I got to where I would send drafts back, particularly to the legal departments, as PDFs, not as editable documents, because particularly legal departments, they always wanted to frickin' tinker with the wording. Like, hey, you can't write dialogue for shit. Sorry. So no, you don't get to reword my stuff, and you don't know why this is structured the way it's structured. So I'm going to give you a PDF. Give me all the notes you want, but don't mess with my dialogue, pal. You don't know how to do it. And it was fascinating. And it was a lens on why so much written communication stinks in a way. Because you look at the cloud of writing around a project like that. If the end result is 150, 200 word script, we spent thousands of words getting there. And in a sense, the job was sort of trying to find the gold nugget amidst all of the dirt involved in decisions about what the gold nugget was. Excuse me. So, yeah, that's fascinating. Talk to me a bit about the other side of it, which is how we read and how that might have changed in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I wanted to just respond first of all, just briefly to this idea of wanting to get too much information in, and we have this thing of illusory. It's called illusory superiority. If you don't know very much about something, you overestimate how much you know, and this is all over the web. You have people who are experts having in scare quotes, who've read a few blog posts, and think they know all there is to know about that. The so-called Dunning-Kruger effect. Yes. The less we know, the more we think we know. But there is a flip side to that, which is illusory. So the other one's illusory superiority. The flip side is illusory inferiority, where the more we know, the more we underestimate how much we know. We think that we don't know that much because we know how much else there is to know. And in doing that, you overestimate how much other people know. So that's why you get that problem where people just want to pile in all this information because they overestimate how much capacity people have. Incidentally, when you're encountering a topic for the first time, you're relying largely on your working memory. And your working memory does not have much capacity at all. Right. And what you're trying to do is keep that there so that I saw this. I went to an evening talk a year ago. I think it was possibly longer, but it was on quantum computing, and my son was interested in it at the time, and took him along. And this guy started talking about quantum computing, and I think I was about 10 sentences in before I just reached max. I was kind of like, oh, okay, I don't know. Hang on a minute, because they were all new concepts. It's like I was opening new files for each piece of information, and I was trying to hold it in my working memory. And, and every now and then I kind of get overloaded and I go, come on, Rob, come on, let's go again. And it didn't work because it was all new. We used to think that we had capacity for around 7 pieces of information in our working memory. We now know it's more like 3 or 4. It's not very much. When you said 3 priorities, you were right. You're absolutely right, because you can't take in much more than that, but we do it all the time. And this is part of the problem. And I think it's also part of the problem why people don't realize they need to fine tune how they're writing, because they just think, well, I'm just giving them the information and it's perfectly clear, isn't it? And if I give them the information, they'll get the information, and away we go. In terms of how we read, this is, again, we don't, there's quite a lot known about this, and it's not, but it's not something that most people know. So researchers know quite a lot about this, neuroscientists, psychologists, physiologists, anatomists, but not the general public. So that there is, and it's really, really important, because how we read is largely prediction. So what we read initially is what we're expecting to see there, and then we correct. And this goes back to the 1850s. There's a guy called Hermann von Helmholtz. He's a German polymath, and he looked at the structure of the eye and said, I don't think that the eye is sophisticated enough. I mean, it's a wonderful, a wonderful thing, the human eye, or the eye of any animal, but it's not sophisticated enough, he said, for it to account for the pictures we see in our heads. There's so much information around us, so many images, that if it were just the eye we were relying on, it wouldn't work. And it was David Eagleman, the neuroscientist, did a thing on PBS a few years ago called I think it's called The Human Brain or something like that. And he did this lovely thing where he took a digital camera, and he was just, I think he was in Manhattan, and he just said, right, okay, I'm looking around, and my eye is I'm just scanning everything. So I know what I'll do. I'll just take a few quick videos of what I'm seeing. And he just kind of pointed to camera in the way his eyes would, just scanning the horizon, and then looked at the videos afterwards. And of course, it was just a mess, but that was literally recording what was there. So most of what we see is in the brain. The brain is it's making the pictures for us, and it relies on what we've seen before. It relies on what we're expecting to see, therefore. And even you can see this at the neuroscience level. It's when you measure the signal from the eyes when you're reading, there's a signal first from the prefrontal cortex, before, the few milliseconds before the signal from the eyes, and there's also 10 times as much signal coming from the visual cortex. 10 times as much from from that than from the eyes themselves. So this is all happening, and then we're using the eyes to update the picture, really.
I'm going to restate what you just said, because this is like one of those, put a frame around it, for especially if someone's listening and doesn't get to see our facial expression. The brain tells the eye what to see.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Yeah.
Reading and walking through your kitchen and whatever else, but reading exceptionally so, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you see it with, this is why magicians are able to do their job.
Yeah.
They misdirect attention, and you see what you're expecting to see elsewhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. With reading particularly, it's definitely, it has even more of an effect. And The reason is that we didn't evolve to read and write.
Right.
So we don't have a structure in our brain that from birth is devoted to reading and writing. You know, we have what we have is, when we learn to read, is a kind of a connecting together and creating multiple networks that join up things that, structures in the brain that we evolve for other things. So certainly, the visual cortex, the cerebellum controlling the movement of the eyes, but also the auditory areas of the brain. Because when we're reading, we're not just accessing an inner dictionary, which we have to build up, which there's a theory that even that inner dictionary is actually recycling an area that we evolved for something else, but also the sound. So there are two routes when we're reading. It's we with words that are familiar, we just access them from our dictionary. With other words, we actually hear the sounds. So, and the two go together. And also, puns would never work if we weren't relying on sound. If you read a pun, you wouldn't get it. You wouldn't find it funny if you weren't kind of going, oh yeah, it's spelt that way, but actually it's referring to the other word that sounds exactly the same, but is spelt differently. That would not work if you were not hearing the sound in your brain when you're reading. So if all of this is happening, and that's the reason that it takes so long to learn to read. And incidentally, you will pick up your spoken language. You'll pick that up passively just by being around people who are speaking, and you listen to them. But that won't happen with reading. You have to be taught actively how to do it. You have to be, and it takes years, and that's because you're rewiring your brain. And you can see this, if you see something in an alphabet that you're not familiar with, say Arabic or Hebrew or Russian, whatever. When you look at that, you could look at that all day, every day, and you would still not learn to read it. You would need someone to decode it for you, literally.
Well, it's that speed bump experience of reading something in archaic English where the S's look like gigantic F's, and your brain just goes clunk when you hit that. Because
exactly,
you go F, and your head goes, what? No, F is not the plural, but there's a big F there. It's not an F, but right. Yeah.
Yeah. You're not used to seeing it. Absolutely. And as you say, it just brings you to a grinding halt.
By the way, quick backtrack about 14 seconds ago. I think it's in one of Kessler's books. He says a pun is two words joined by a string of sound.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that
exactly. One. Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah. And if you find you might make a typo when you're writing, and you might write down a word that sounds the same but has nothing to do. And it could be a homophone. It could be a word that it sounds exactly the same but is spelled differently. So two with two O's, or one, or a W.
Right.
But it might also be a word that sounds kind of similar. So chain and change, maybe, or something like that. It's got
because the auditory
sounds in common. Yeah. Phonemes. And that's because you're hearing it when you're writing. So there's that. But there is also, when you are reading, the mechanics of reading limit. So it's not just you've got the amount of information that the eye can take in. You've got the mechanics. You've got the way the eyes read. So we read in these little jumps called saccades.
Yes.
And so we've got this illusion, and it is an illusion of reading something smoothly and seeing the whole thing. That's just created in your brain. It's actually exactly.
Well, it's like the video camera you mentioned, right? It's like, here's the skyline. Whoa, that's horrible footage. Your brain was doing a saccade across the skyline, telling the eye to see pattern.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the point of fine focus, which is a small area of the fovea, which is very rich in cone cells. It's tiny, and there's only room there for, might only be 3 or 4 letters. So, if you stop when you're reading something and look and see how much is in sharp focus, it really is only a few letters, normally if you're reading an email or something.
Yeah.
And there was a I mentioned science that people don't know about. Go back to 1975. There were two scientists, George McConkie and Keith Rayner, and what they did is they kind of created this devilish device where it used an eye tracker to work out where you were looking, and it would replace everything else with complete nonsense, complete gibberish. So if you were reading some text on a screen, it was a moving window of clarity where it was the actual text, it should be there. And it was only, it could be up to 7, 8 letters. And as long as those were the right words, everything else was irrelevant. And in fact, what happened is the volunteers in the experiment didn't know that there was anything wrong. They didn't notice that everything else was complete gibberish. So what that shows is that, that is how we are reading this moving window of clarity. Incidentally, that's why we miss huge typos, partly because we're expecting to see it, because of the limitations of the eye. But also because even when you look at it carefully, it's only a small part that's in focus. And so and that is why we miss the biggest typos of all. You can have something in 34-point type, and you think, how on earth did I miss it? It's in a huge headline on a slide in my presentation. Why did I miss that? And it's because the fine point of focus will probably just be a small part of one letter. So you can't get the whole letter in until, of course, you're presenting it, and everyone in a packed auditorium can see it because they've got the distance and they can fit it in.
Well, and also because I'm guessing, you know the research, I wouldn't, but I'm guessing that as the prediction mechanism is working, like, you're not evaluating letter for letter, right? You're on the narrative flow or the language flow, and the fact that there's a letter that doesn't belong there, it doesn't, like, that's not the structure I'm taking in. I'm taking in the story you're telling me. Who gives a crap about the extra S?
Even though, you can be extremely motivated and still miss it. You've got this really strong confirmation bias. And you just assume that it's right, even if you tell yourself, I'm checking this carefully. I've done it, you've done it. It's kind of, you check it 10 times and you think, how did I miss that? But you come back to it a few days later and it's a different story. You then spot it. But when you're in the moment, what you are doing is you are using all of your knowledge to and overlaying that.
Because you can't not overlay your knowledge.
Sorry?
You can't not overlay your knowledge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that leads me on to another example, actually, which is that there's a study, I think it's about 30 years ago now, Elizabeth Newton at Stanford. It's called Tappers and Listeners. Have you ever heard of this?
Yes. I quoted this one. I'm so delighted to hear you bring that up. Yes.
So do you want to tell the story or shall I?
You tell it, because you sound a lot better.
The voice is okay. It's so what this researcher did was she was trying to test how much what we hear in our brain influences what we think other people can hear in terms when we're, it was literally with sound. So what she asked them to do is she said, look, if you tap out a well-known tune, I don't know, on a desk or whatever, if you tap just the rhythm of that tune, how likely is that the person listening to that will be able to name that tune? And they were tunes that people would know, I don't know, Star Spangled Banner, but it's Happy Birthday, things that would be familiar. And when you're tapping that out, if you're kind of singing Happy Birthday in your head and tapping that out, you just think, how could this is going to be so obvious. How can you not get this?
Yes.
So she asked people to estimate, how many people out of 100 will be able to get that. And the average was people thought 50%, 50 out of 100 would be able to identify these tunes. And in fact, the actual number was 2.5%. That was the average. It wasn't 2.5 people, but it was a fraction of the. We vastly overestimate how easy it is for people to understand what we are. The information we're giving them, because we've got the tune in our head, and we can't not hear it. As you say, you can't. Have you ever done something where where you're going to travel somewhere and you were looking forward to a vacation, you'd never been there before, and you kind of have in your mind what that place is going to be like,
Yeah.
and you think about it and you imagine yourself there, and you think, oh, it's going to be amazing, and then you go, and of course it's very different from your model. You know, there'll be some things that are the same, but it's not the same as you imagined it. It was bound to be different. Have you ever tried to then go back to what you said, to that picture that you had in your mind before you went there? You can't unknow it. You cannot unknow it. And it's true of all our knowledge. You know, you can forget some stuff, but you can't go back to where you were before you learnt it. And so it's, you know, and that's why it's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of the reader. But it's also why we do miss these mistakes, because, as you say, you know, you can't not predict it. You can't not see it. Your brain is saying, "Yep, been there, done that. It's fine. Let's just move on. Come on, this looks great." And it's all comes down to prediction, prior knowledge, and the way the brain reads, not the eyes, the brain.
Yeah. I want to take the how people read thread one step farther, and I'm keeping the audience for this series in mind. Yeah, email marketers, business professionals. As an avid reader, as obviously you are, it bugs me to watch my own reading habits have not degraded exactly, but shifted so much in the last 20, 30 years as I read more and more on screen in chunks. And where I was the kid who would get lost in a book, and still as adult do, I skim and scan with the best of them. I sit down and go flip, 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 flip through the New York Times in about that length of time. I didn't read it. I don't know what you call what I did with it, but it wasn't what I used to call reading. And yet I spend more time in the skimming now than I do the concentrated, focused, sit your butt down and read this material. And it does worry me a bit. And yet email marketers have to write to the skimmer more than the reader, I think. Reactions?
Oh, definitely. There was some a big piece of research funded by the EU, which you know combined lots of studies, and it found that when we are reading on screen, you know, that works really well generally, unless it's something that's quite emotive or it's something that's cognitively challenging, and then we find it easier to read in hard copy. So you know, there is definitely something different about reading on screen, and yet, as you say, you know, that's who you're trying to reach when you are writing these emails. So you have to bear that in mind.
Yeah.
You have to, I always say to people, you know, people will read until they can stop reading, and then they will. And you know, and the job of every sentence really is to get people to read the next sentence. You know, hook them in, keep them reading. It's like trying to bump start a car. The most difficult thing is to get them to read in the first place. And then then it has a momentum of its own. So, but don't put stuff in there that's going to bring them to a juddering halt.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, an example would be, you know, a word that's going to be probably unfamiliar to them, or a word that's in all capitals. You know, it's kind of, you can read it. You can read capitals as easily as you can read stuff in, you know, in lowercase or upper and lowercase, but it will stand out, and it will, and so every time they see that, it's going chop, 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 you know, and it's kind of almost drawing attention to itself. Good writing's invisible. You know, you should read it without trying, or without even wanting to read it. You know, it should draw you in, and you're not aware that you're reading, because of this idea that we didn't evolve to read and write. Reading is much harder than we think. And so it's much easier to just to skim on to the next thing. Just as, you know, just as if you're going down your to-do list during the day and you hit something that's a bit difficult, it's much easier to just change to something else, or check the news, or check social media. That's what the brain does when something gets a bit difficult. It looks for a break. And if you're reading an email, it's going to say, yeah, I'll read that later. I'm just going to look at the next one, or I'm going to make a cup of coffee, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So you need to make something flow, but there's another reason you should do that. There's something called the fluency heuristic, which says that the easier something is to process, the more likely we are to believe it, and to just accept it. So if you've got to work hard, then we kind of think harder about the content. And we might think, and then in thinking harder, we might just conclude very quickly that we can't be bothered with it and we're going to do something else. But if something flows and it's easy to process, we equate easy to process with true. So,
Yeah.
if I say to you, how many people live in the Australian capital of Sydney? Is it 1 million, 3 million, or 5 million? And you might start answering the question, but actually the answer is none of those, because the Australian capital of Sydney is Canberra. The Australian capital is Canberra, not Sydney. So what the brain does is it answers the question that's easy to answer, rather than looking carefully at the information. So this, you just see this all the time. If something is easy to process, and in other words, flipping that, if you make it easy to process, if you write it well, if you make it flow, if you hook people in, if you keep them reading, they're more likely to accept it. And you really, I can't stress this enough. You really need to be very disciplined about this. Try to or overcome your confirmation bias. Look at it the next day, looking at the day after.
Read it out loud.
Just read it out loud. Absolutely. Send it to yourself in another format. Take a screenshot, and look at it as a screenshot. Just anything you can to kind of override that confirmation bias. Send the email to yourself to see what it will look like, when somebody else receives it. Look at what the subject line will look like on your phone, and think, if are the first. I mean, I think you've got about 40 characters in the email on an iPhone screen. If it's in portrait.
Yeah.
What are the words at the beginning saying, and are they leading you to? Do they want to make you open it? It's this has been overdone, of course, with things like clickbait. But originally, it got the term clickbait because people would click on it. So there are still things you can learn. Certainly using curiosity. So, look at those first few words of your subject line and think, as that person is scanning down their inbox, are those first few words going, not the whole subject, just the first 2 or 3 words? Are they going to make people want to read the rest? It's so important to be aware of that. It's like a Netflix effect, isn't it? You've got all these different things on cable TV, and as a result, we don't land on any of them. We just keep going to the next one, because we can't decide. So you've got to make them decide, just to take a chance. And then when you've got them, get them reading that first sentence, and then keep them reading.
We could do this for hours. I swear to God, really could. This is really awesome. But I'm trying to think of some sort of tail off things, watching the clock, so I don't tie up your whole evening. Okay, one, if you were gonna give very encapsulated advice, sort of why you're doing what you're doing now, what would you say, particularly to people, because I think the audience for this podcast is mostly folks in some part of business. Like, what do you tell them about reading and writing? How do you distill what you're learning right now?
Reading is something that is incredibly powerful. You're seeing dots and squiggles on a screen, and you're hearing a voice in your head. It's a lot harder than we think. So that miracle is a miracle of adaptation, not evolution. It's something, the effort of that decreases, but it never goes away. And it's very easy to forget that. However, it is something that gives you the opportunity to lead the voice in someone's head, to influence them, to get the decision you want. But you don't do it by viewing it as transferring data from your head to theirs.
Yeah.
You've got to do it by synchronizing your brain with theirs. And that can be done. It's not easy, but if you learn more about it and and with practice and delving into some of these topics, you can get you get a much better chance of doing that. And if that sounds daunting, I would say the encouraging bit is most people aren't doing this. Most people don't get this. Most people are taking it for granted. So if you delve into this and you start to be to improve your knowledge and to start to understand some of these mechanisms and the techniques that go with them, then you give yourself a winning edge. And you only need to win by a nose, just like a horse winning a race. You only need that small advantage, and most people aren't doing it. So it is within reach. You don't have to do what I've done and dedicate your life to it. There are things you can do, and every one thing you do, they stack up. They all help. So just doing one of the things, or being aware of one of the things that I've mentioned today, will definitely give you a competitive edge. And as I say, it goes right across the board. It's the rising tide that lifts all boats. If you focus on this, it won't just help you in your marketing. It will help you in your execution. It will help you in your strategy. The whole shebang, operations. It connects everything together. And because we write all the time and we read all the time and we don't speak to each other, this is the golden thread. This is the thing that can tie it all together.
Nice. And I see evidence supporting exactly what you said in some unexpected places. For example, I run a SaaS software company, and I've been involved with a few groups that are essentially how to make your SaaS software business work better. The top piece of advice is always talk to your customers, live with them, understand them, write down what they say, which really amounts to, like, get on their wavelength and be in sync with them.
Yeah. And, that's that, you use their language.
And use their language. In fact, the advice is essentially pick up and steal their language. If a customer says, whatever, squiggle, you go like, why do I keep hearing squiggle? Maybe we should use squiggle as a key word. Why? Because they're using it.
Absolutely. And that contradicts the contrary advice to the common advice to not use jargon. Because if you're using the customer's jargon,
then
the customer's jargon, not yours.
Not yours. Yes.
So you can use that to be, of course you can really screw that up and use it correctly. So get someone to check it, but at least listen to those things. Listen to how they describe their problems.
Yes.
And describe their problems in their terms, not yours.
In their terms.
And you will only do that by talking to them. That's the only way to do it. You can't unhear what's in your head.
And you just said it. So I was hoping we'd have a chance to at least touch on it. That bridge between verbal language and written language that we have to do as a person. There's no other way to get there. It still fascinates me how talking and writing are not the same thing. And you must know a bunch of research about this. Like, they coexist, they affect each other fundamentally, but they're not the same. It's almost not the same language, I swear.
We do often use, different terminology, different sentence structures. And if you hear somebody, speak, or rather, if you transcribe exactly what they've said,
yes,
when you read the transcript, it doesn't make sense. And yet when you were listening to them, it did.
Made perfect sense.
So, there's something else going on there. But we evolved to speak and listen. Yes. So this is something we are hardwired to do. So it's different in that respect. There's even evidence that the release of hormones is different in writing.
I believe that.
There was have you ever been stuck in a kind of a tense exchange of email or Slack messages or whatever, text messaging? and you're trying to resolve it with, and why do we do this? We just stay texting, trying to resolve it. When if we took that phone from in front of us and just moved it up to our ear, we could resolve it.
Yeah.
But when you actually speak to somebody, often what happens is you feel this kind of relief washing over you. And you kind of go, oh, right. And your shoulders drop and you go, oh, I see what you mean. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. And you work it out. There's some research that suggests that when we are listening to the human voice, we release oxytocin, which is something that's really central to how we interact as human beings. But when we're reading text messages from those same people, we don't release oxytocin. Which makes sense because there's nothing less natural than reading and writing. And yet we are wired to speak and listen.
And yet this is what you're doing. I'm watching the clock, and I hate to, because like I said, I seriously could type your whole evening. But where do you want to take what you're doing now in terms of impact on others? You could call that business, you could call that mission, you could call it chicken salad, but where are you headed with this?
This will hopefully find its way into a book. So that's the end game for me. It is a book, and but something that not just people who are fascinated by grammar and punctuation. I'm not trying to preach to the choir here. This is something that just feels much bigger than that. And so really what I'm trying to do is to get this message out there. And I'm doing a lot of work, and I'm writing about it on my blog. I've put together some free training as well. But that is the goal. This could take me the rest of my life. It's just something. It's certainly a big enough topic for that, and it's not going away. So I'm just really everything I can to get this message out there and make people more aware of this research.
Terrific. I'm going to talk to you for a minute after we stop recording, but Rob, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for connecting and conversing.
You're welcome. Can I just mention, actually, if people want to sign up for that course, so they just go to robashton.com/influence. It's called Silent Influence, and it's all in there, and that's probably the best way to keep on top of this. But no, Matthew, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thanks so much for inviting me.
Terrific. My guest, Rob Ashton, robashton.com, and I am signing up for Silent Influence as soon as I finish talking with Rob. Rob, thanks. We'll cut the recording.